Hi everybody, it's Sarah Hall, Head of Apprenticeship Services for NCFE, and Keith Jenner. We're just going to give everybody a couple of minutes to join, and we're just going to mute our call for 2 or 3 minutes. Give everybody else a chance to join. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I think we'll start. My name is Sarah Hall, and I'm Head of Apprenticeship Services for NCFE. I'm joined today by my colleague Keith Jenner, who is one of our endpoint assessors and has been delivering endpoint assessment for NCFE since the outset. Welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for joining us. We're going to talk to you today about some of our experiences to date as an endpoint assessment organisation and the lessons that we have learned, which will help you to ensure that your apprentices get the most out of endpoint assessment, both in terms of what it has meant for us to be an effective endpoint assessment organisation, as well as some of the practical lessons which can help you, employers, and of course the apprentice to deliver successful outcomes. So we're going to today take you through a little bit about our journey to date, share with you some of the feedback that we've had from you, our providers, and the employers that we work with. And then Keith's going to take you through a little bit of detail around some of the lessons we've learned from an endpoint assessor's perspective so far, in terms of the different assessment methods, in terms of preparation for Gateway itself. And then if you'd like to pop any questions in the little box on your screen, if we have 5 or 10 minutes left at the end of the webinar, then Keith and I will answer as many of your questions as possible. So before we even went live with our first assessments, we'd already adapted our delivery model considerably, and that's something that we fully expect that will continue to evolve. So in terms of the the components of being an endpoint assessment organisation. Before we went live, we brought all of our product development in-house. And the reason for doing that was it was to allow us to control our quality tightly and begin to focus on the user's experience. So some of the questions that we're asking ourselves now in terms of the materials that are available to providers, employers and apprentices are, how can we make those materials more interactive? How can we deploy technology to make materials more accessible? And how can we use our product, our materials and our guidance to make endpoint assessment more understandable for everybody involved? In terms of the service that we provide beyond the delivery of endpoint assessment itself, very early on we recognised the increasing importance of proactive support. So where we might have thought in the early days that we would be waiting for apprentices to get to Gateway, we understand the important part that we can play in being proactive and ensuring that well before Gateway, the organisations that we're working with understand the platform that we use to deliver endpoint assessment, the EPA platform. They are familiar with the assessment materials, the guidance materials that are available, and they understand the process that the apprentice is about to go through. As a result of all that, we launched our EPA Plus program, probably at the end of the summer last year. So we've got a team of client relationship executives whose primary purpose, and each of our customers has a dedicated client relationship executive. Their primary purpose is to make sure that the process is as understandable as possible for everybody involved. We have our own dedicated endpoint assessment, quality and compliance team, and they are focused purely on endpoint assessment, nothing else, which means that we are always in step with regulation. And we fully employ all of our endpoint assessors, which wasn't something that we intended to do at the start. But again, that's all about making sure that everybody that we work with in assessment understands the way that we do things, that they are fully trained, up to date, and are as consistent as possible, so that the experience that one apprentice gets in one standard is as similar as it can be in another standard. It also allows us to keep a really close eye on capacity planning and scheduling, so that we are always able to deliver endpoint assessment when we say we'll be able to deliver endpoint assessment. Just waiting for the screen to catch up. So the key themes at a headline level that we've learned over the last year and a half have been that when it comes to onboarding customers, training providers, employers, it's not about signing up as many organisations as possible. It is for us about working in partnership, building communication with the right organisations to support successful outcomes. As far as developing products is concerned, we have stripped back our product portfolio, and we're very careful and considered about which standards we decide to apply for approval for. So we're not about developing endpoint assessment for as many standards as possible. For us, it's been about identifying what we can do well and doing those right things well. In terms of understanding our customers, we've put a lot of investment and focus into building systems which deliver insight that allow us that visibility, which means that we can support you and the apprentice better, and we can have the right resource when and where we need it. And as far as the delivery is concerned, endpoint assessment as an assessor, and I'm sure Keith will testify to this when I hand over, is a fast-paced role. It requires a degree of technical know-how. It's very process-driven. It's not right for everybody. So we have an absolute commitment to getting the right people in the role so that we can continue to be consistent with what it is that we deliver. So just before I hand over to Keith, in terms of just some of the key themes that we're hearing from employers and providers, and I'm sharing this because it's useful for us as an endpoint assessment organisation when we're talking to other endpoint assessment organisations to understand that some of the challenges that we're facing are shared across all endpoint assessment organisations. So as far as employers are concerned, some of the things that we hear are that with any business, large or small, you develop your own internal language, and the language of standards is very different. And that difference can make it more difficult for apprentices because of the unfamiliarity of the language. And that goes back to the point I was making earlier about product development. Our focus is about making materials and the assessment experience as understandable and accessible as possible for an apprentice. Another challenge is that of taking generic standards and preparing apprentices to pass a very specific endpoint assessment. So that's all about how we ensure that assessment is fit for practical industry. Ensuring that assessment methods themselves really appraise competence in the areas of the apprenticeship. One of the biggest challenges is compiling showcase evidence in a timely fashion in time for Gateway, and the next theme relates back to that one as well. It's the overall challenge of scheduling endpoint assessment with an organisational rota. So the ongoing challenge of getting and keeping operational buy-in to the time required to prepare showcase evidence and out to take the assessment methods themselves, it is an ongoing challenge in industry. With providers, while the screen catches up, a common theme is delays waiting for the certificates needed to go through Gateway. Another one which we hear a lot is that learners simply disappear. So we may think that they're nearly ready to go, but then all of a sudden they're very difficult to contact and make the necessary arrangements for the next steps. Still an ongoing uncertainty of what needs to be submitted as evidence, and Keith's going to come on and talk in more detail about that. An uncertainty on the timeframes for Gateway, and these are all the reasons why we have implemented a dedicated, proactive support team to ensure that we're starting to remove these barriers of uncertainty, and over time uncertainty will turn to certainty. But where endpoint assessment is now, uncertainty is the prevailing theme. A lack of understanding of the assessment plan itself, and again that's one of the areas of focus of our team, is to help people to understand where they are in the journey, what steps are next, in order to fully prepare the apprentice for Gateway. And again, a lack of understanding currently about who's responsible for what. So who's responsible for delivering feedback to the apprentice, who's responsible for invigilation. So hopefully some of the things that I've talked about so far have resonated with everybody, and I'm going to hand over to Keith now to talk about his practical experience over the last year delivering endpoint assessment.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Can you hand over control?
Yeah.
So from an endpoint assessor's perspective, as Sarah mentioned, I've been in endpoint assessment over a year since NCFE started delivering, and it's been incredibly challenging and incredibly rewarding. However, the amount of change and the amount of learning that we've had to go through as a company, including me as an assessor, has been an absolute steep learning curve. So hopefully we can deliver some knowledge back to you on this webinar. So we're going to run through some of the lessons learned from my point of view, and we're going to cover Gateway, because for me, everything is geared around the apprentice, and what we want is a really smooth handover from the training providers, putting the correct information onto Gateway, making sure that smooth transition from you to us, so that we can show a really smooth transition into the endpoint assessment. We can go through some of the endpoint assessments and some of the lessons that I've learned, some of the good things I've seen, and some of the things that we can learn from. Some things around feedback with regard to what kind of feedback you receive from us, why you receive that feedback, and why it's important that the apprentice receives the feedback results from each assessment so that they can learn for it, potentially to move on to the next one, which could be relevant. And also we're going to go on to results. With regards to feedback and results, we'll also go through whose responsibility it is to deliver that back to the apprentice. And again, this goes back to the understanding of everybody's roles and responsibilities in endpoint assessment, so that we can deliver it as smoothly as possible, giving the apprentice the very best experience. Just going to move on to the next slide when it catches up. Bear with me. Seems to have stuck. Just bear with me. Sarah, could you just try and move on the slides on? Okay, so with regard to Gateway, what we've found is occasionally when we get to Gateway, there are some issues which sort of moves on to delays of getting the apprentice started and assessment happening with the endpoint assessment with their relevant standard. So with regards to Gateway, it does sound really simple, and you know, on the move up to it, I'm sure everybody's aware of exactly what they need. But this is just some of the things we've seen. Correct maths and English evidence uploaded. It's really important. It's quite simple, and we do realise that. However, we have seen a couple where foreign certificates has been put forward for maths and English evidence, which is absolutely fine. We're fully, obviously, aware of the situation that's absolute evidence that can cover that. However, it does need a comparison certificate for any international qualifications. So there is a website that's on our resources and available from us, obviously out in the wider web as well. There's a comparison certificate that you need to upload alongside that for that international certificate to be recognised as English and maths evidence. There's also standard specific evidence that needs to be uploaded. So for instance, on the business administration, the project would need to be uploaded at Gateway. Showcases uploaded at Gateway ready for assessment. There's a lot of things that you need to just check with regards to the relevant standards about exactly what you need to upload to make sure that that's ready for us to start getting the assessments into play. We're also looking at the planning. So who's going to be organising dates? Is it you as the training provider? Is the employer going to be involved? Or are we going direct to the apprentice? And it's really good to have that full idea so that we know the relationship we have with you, how that works, who to get in contact with, so that we can book them dates as soon as we possibly can. Correct details on the profile with full contact details. Sounds very simple. However, we do a few times have to go chasing and Googling telephone numbers. So whoever the main point of contact is, that's the contact details we would need. And if we can have contact numbers, emails as well, then that really does make the process much smoother. Also with regards to the planning, what does the endpoint assessment look like for my apprentice? What are the timescales? We work on an 8-week SLA to deliver the endpoint assessment and deliver the overall results to you. What are the assessments? Digital first, have we got the technology? Have we got the laptop, or have they got the access to the technology for the apprentice to deliver a digital first assessment like an interview or a professional discussion? All this is things just to take into account before your apprentice goes through Gateway, so that we can make this as smooth as possible. We're not turning up to assessment trying to work out technology. We use multiple platforms now to give the best chance and flexibility to mould in with the apprentice and exactly what their needs are to deliver endpoint assessment. And just their planning, just to remember before they go through Gateway, is the training provider's responsibility for passing grading and feedback onto the apprentice. We'll touch on it in a moment. All grading and feedback is available after each assessment, a maximum of five days. So it will be within 5 days available to you on our CEPA platform. Just move on the slide. So with regards to the endpoint assessments, we're going to go into a little more detail now on the preparation, the portfolio and showcase assessments. I picked these specifically in the fact that these are the assessments that you have the most control over on behalf of the apprentice, to upload the correct evidence, to make sure it's covering all the standards required, make sure there's a nice variety in there as well, and also about checking the assessment plan, just to make sure that you understand all the nuances and different areas of each standard, and so that you can pass that on to your apprentice so that they know exactly what to expect. If we can just move the slide on. So preparing for endpoint assessments, and from throughout their program, really preparing for endpoint assessment, especially in the last 3 months, going through Gateway and throughout the endpoint assessment, what do you as a training provider need to do to help the apprentice prepare for the endpoint assessment? Just on the top, use resources to understand the assessment. And it's really simple. All of them are available on CEPA, from the apprentices guides to the providers guide, about professional discussions, interviews, how they're going to be run, how many questions there are, how long it's going to last. And these are really important areas, so that the apprentices, and I've seen it before, sort of towards the start, the apprentices really are, A, they're nervous, B, they're not 100% sure what to expect. Are they going to be sat there for 20 minutes or an hour? There's a massive difference. So a full understanding is vital, and that is all available through the resources on CEPA. We touched on it before, the digital first compatibility. We offer, as endpoint assessors, for the digital first assessment, we would offer trial runs, so that we can have a bit of a test of the compatibility of the technology, just so that we're not turning up 5 minutes before there's problems with technology, and again, it all becomes a bit, it's not smooth. It doesn't put the apprentice at ease, where they could be showing some nerves, and that's something that we can really get right first off. So we do offer tests, and that's something to take into account. Mock assessments, it's not for everybody. You as training providers know your apprentices. Some are very confident and can fly through endpoint assessment with minimal support. Some aren't. Some are really nervous in interviews or professional discussion settings and need much more preparation. And to deliver mock assessments prior to Gateway is an absolute is an idea of how to give them that support, give them practice, even if you do a Skype call with them because they haven't used that before. They sit in front of somebody different just to get that, talking to a stranger thing for the first time. that really is good practice just to get them really ready to go. Understand the assessment plan, just to give them a full background of how the endpoint assessment is going to work, what's involved, what grading they can expect to be achieving, and things like that, and some real detail just to get them prepared for the endpoint assessment. Does your apprentice know the standards being assessed? Some of the assessments, it's not the whole standards within the each assessment. So for instance, customer service, there are some standards covered in the showcase that aren't covered in the professional discussion, which aren't covered in the observation. There may be some fold over of standards that get covered in both, but really an understanding of exactly what's going to be assessed. And I see this with showcases for customer service being uploaded, talking about brand values and, you know, certain criteria, and it's like that's not part of that assessment. So you need to be fully aware of what standards are being assessed at each assessment, so that apprentice can feel very confident on what they're going to be asked and they can prepare accordingly. Apprentice support during endpoint assessment. I've had some training providers suggest that once they've gone through Gateway, that's it, and it couldn't be further from the truth. They really do need that support after each assessment to give them the feedback of how they did, recognise areas that could be carried forward in some standards and can be put right, and really support them through each assessment. If they've done an interview and they came off it and feeling really nervous, can you fit a mock interview or mock professional discussion before the next one, just to put them at ease? Absolutely, support from the training provider through the whole endpoint assessment process is absolutely vital. We can move slide on. So talking about showcase and portfolio assessments, and this is the area that the training provider really has control about what's uploaded on behalf of the apprentice to gain a grade which would affect their overall grade. Quality, not quantity. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but never has it been so true with regard to uploading showcase and portfolio assessments. Witness testimonies and professional discussions, observations, they really are great evidence as long as the detail's there. And just a bit of a sort of advice on this, with regard to a professional discussion or observation on dealing with conflict in the customer service practitioner, the witness testimony or assessment on program just saying, yes, he dealt with conflict and he did this and this, it was, you know, I've seen it and it covers this standard, that's great. In endpoint assessment, the dealing with difficult customers is broken down into 6 different sections for each interaction. So that's the kind of detail we're looking for, is how did they keep calm? How did they resolve the issue? Did they keep any records? You know, it's broken down into some real detail. So whenever you are thinking on program about witness testimonies or professional discussions and observations, it is that absolute holistic detail about exactly what did they do to do that, which will get them a good grade in endpoint assessment. Submit a wide range of evidence, and what's best for the apprentice, we don't really want to see a whole bank of knowledge questions that's been given and they're typing up. We want to see a wide range of observations, witness testimonies and professional discussions delivered well can go into, moving into the next part, and go into multiple areas. We want to get the most out of each piece of evidence, and we want the apprentice to succeed. So we're looking at, can it go into numerous areas? What else does it cover? But it really does need that detail and a wide range of evidence. When you get them talking in a professional discussion, they quite often go into a bit more than they normally would if they were typing up a knowledge question or anything like that. So while there's a place for knowledge questions, a wide range of evidence of different assessment methods is definitely what we found that would get better grades. Moving on, we covered it before, but again, it's really important. There is no knowledge, skills, and behaviour criteria being assessed, and keep the evidence to this. It's going back to that quality and quantity thing. It's not about a massive amount of evidence because it's going to be covered. It's about, I've seen customer service portfolio evidence get good grades on 10 to 12 pieces of evidence. So again, it's not about that quantity, it's about the quality of what you're putting forward. Use the resources. NCFE on CEPA have created evidence summary and record sheets, and they're there so you can go through the portfolio evidence that you're putting forward and just ticking off and making sure every single piece is covered, because what you don't want to do is just be putting something forward that you hope is right, and realistically it's probably not getting the apprentice the grade that they should be getting. So again, use the resources and the evidence summary just to make sure you're covering every point and you're confident what you're putting forward is absolutely covering everything. If directly assessed, then portfolio evidence should be developed within the last 3 months of the programme. So basically anything prior to 3 months of their programme, it's definitely best practice to review it, update it, and to ensure currency and validity. So if they've got numerous pieces of evidence on health and safety or something like that, just a small professional discussion around that, just to make sure it's current, just to make sure if any policy changes, it's there. Because what we generally don't want to do is look at something sort of 2 years ago or right at the beginning of their programme. It's good to get that sort of current and validity back up, just to make sure that's all relevant. Just move the slide on. Observation assessment. What we're seeing is we arrange a date for an observation, we communicate that out to training providers and apprentices, and sometimes they're not expecting us, e.g. the managers or anything like that, and that really the training providers and apprentices responsibility, just to make sure everybody knows we're coming, they know we're going to do an assessment, and especially with regards to the customer service practitioner, which the observation really does just base around making sure they have customer interactions, it can really be avoid a fail, which really shouldn't be happening in sort of customer service when all they need to do is deal with 5 or 6 customers and they'll be looking good for a good grade. Know what criteria needs to be covered. It's not always the standard. As I said, in the customer service one, what's needed in the observation isn't necessarily covered in the showcase or the professional discussion. So just know within that observation exactly what needs to be covered. GDPR, as it says, we love to have detail, but we don't like to see anything we shouldn't. So just keep into account what we can see and what we can't, and that should also be planned for prior. Just moving on. So feedback. With regards to the feedback that we can give the apprentice by yourselves, there's no developmental feedback. So we basically tell you what knowledge, skills and behaviours you've covered and what you haven't covered. So it's really the facts about the achievement of the assessment. It's this grade, these are the criteria you covered, these are the criteria you didn't. And it's up to the training provider to communicate grading and feedback to the apprentice. Now, the not developmental bit is exactly as it says. We're not going to say you didn't cover this criteria, but what you could have done is this, this and this. But if you're using the evidence summary sheet and then you're mapping that back into what the criteria was covered and not covered, then you should be able to see exactly why that was. And there's obviously appeals procedures and things like that in place if you don't agree. Summative feedback given at the end of the endpoint assessment. Once all assessments have been completed, the apprentice will receive a summative feedback and an overall grade feedback form, which basically covers all assessments, the scores and the grade achieved, along with feedback in each assessment and an overall grade. And this will be emailed out when the overall grade has been updated on our SEPA system. So you will receive that along with the apprentice and the employer if we have all the employer details. So moving on. So results. Training providers to download results and feedback and inform the apprentice. That's for each individual assessment. As I said on the summative, which is at the end of the endpoint assessment, there will be some feedback form that goes out to the apprentice. But individual assessments, feedback and grades can be downloaded and they need to be passed on to the apprentice. The summative feedback emailed to apprentice and you confirming overall grade. That's when the final assessment has been completed and gone through our quality just to make sure that that's correct. The third one down, know your possible grades for your apprentice from the assessment plan. This goes back, and I mentioned it a couple of times about knowing about the assessment plan, because some are fail, pass and distinction. Sometimes there's a merit available, and it really is just a bit of a knowledge so that the apprentice knows from the start what grades are available for their endpoint assessment that they're going to go through, so there's no surprises. And just touching on again, the training provider is responsible for the apprentice's whole journey, including the EPA. So please support them through it. What we've seen, and it's absolutely evident from everything that I've seen in the last year, that the apprentice grades, the best grades, are when the apprentice is very knowledgeable about the endpoint assessment and is supported by the training provider and the employer. And that's exactly how you get a good grade. It's when everybody understands what's going on and is working together to make sure that that happens. Once one of them cogs sort of falls away a little bit, there's a real showing of evidence of that in grades and how easy it is to take apprentices through endpoint assessment, how they feel about it. So please support the apprentice through the whole journey. Don't think that endpoint assessment, that's what we're going to be doing. So I think that could be all from me. And I think Sarah's just going to take over now.
Yes, thanks very much for that, Keith. So it looks like we will have time for questions, which I'll take a look at in a second. But the summary in terms of what we've learned as an organisation and in the delivery day-to-day of endpoint assessment is that what we set out to do at the outset is not what we're doing today, and it won't be what we're doing in 12 months' time. Our understanding of endpoint assessment now tells us that it will continue to evolve. Nothing's going to stand still over the next 12 to 24 months. Delays and uncertainty are still a common theme across everybody, from the apprentice, employers, providers and other endpoint assessment organisations, as we all build knowledge and understanding of the delivery of endpoint assessment. And in order to support the building of that knowledge, constantly seeking feedback and getting insight into what actually is happening is key. So just as an example of that, a couple of months ago, and I don't know whether people on this call may have received a call from one of our EPA Plus team, but we contacted a number of providers to understand their readiness in relation to particular cohorts of apprentices. And then we followed that up the next month with a call to understand if they didn't go through Gateway, why they didn't go through Gateway, to see whether there was anything that we've missed in our understanding that's already part of our preparation process that we could build in to share with other providers in the future. And that's the kind of thing that we will continue to do in order to be an effective endpoint assessment organisation. We want apprentices to be as prepared as they can be for endpoint assessment when they get to Gateway. So for that being the case, working in partnership with providers and employers is absolutely paramount. It's only through taking a partnership approach that we can really focus on the apprentice and deliver those successful outcomes to apprentices. Thank you. I'll just take a look at questions now and see if we have any. Thank you. I'm just reading these through, Keith. I might need to pass across to, in fact, I will need to pass across to you to answer most of these questions.
No problem. So passing, grading and feedback onto the apprentice. That I'm not.
Keith,
do you want to grab that one, Sarah?
I think I can answer that one.
I know I'm on the rest of them.
That was just an NCFE decision that the training provider passes grading and feedback to the apprentice, and actually we have had feedback in relation to that from a number of providers, and what we are doing at the moment is working on changing that so that apprentices potentially, for example, have access to the CEPA platform, and they can access their results and grading directly, so the feedback comes from NCFE to the apprentice. So we have had feedback about that, and we are looking at ways that we can change that so that the feedback comes directly from us. Over to you, Keith.
Okay. So, Wendy, is there a difference between evidence summary record sheets and the tracking sheet? There is different evidence summary records for each standard, and some of them are mandatory on the checklist. So there's a couple of reasons for this. It's just, first of all, to make sure all the documents uploaded so that we can refer to it if we think we may be missing a document, or if we've gone through the whole of the process of the assessment and we're missing some really key bits, we'll refer to the evidence tracker, the evidence summary record sheet, just to see where you thought that was. So yeah, some of them are mandatory actually on the checklist to go through Gateway, but that's by standard. Again, Wendy, regarding observation assessments, would it not be better for the EPA? The reason as far as liaising with the employer, we probably can, and we can go, yes, we're arriving on the 10th of June at 1 o'clock for an hour to observe Jimmy. However, it's a little bit more to it than that, which we can't get involved in the fact that, yes, we're arriving at that date and time. We need to make sure that Jimmy is doing their job role for an hour. He needs to cover this criteria, so he needs to be dealing with interacting with customers, and there's a lot more to do it. So although, Wendy, yeah, absolutely, we could liaise with the employer, but we can only tell them when we're coming and we're going to observe Jimmy for an hour. There's much more to it than that, which is why that goes back to the planning of the assessment, that people need to be involved to make sure that criteria is happening with that hour. So that's why we suggest that the training provider who's supporting the apprentice through the endpoint assessment is just there. We're involve everyone in the conversation about date and time, but it's everything that goes on behind that for that apprentice to get a good grade in that observation is why the training provider, the apprentice and the employer need to get together to plan that. Is it possible to see an example of a feedback record? We could do a mock-up feedback record, yeah, absolutely, and email it out. Sarah, is that okay? We've got everybody's email, I would suggest, on the webinar?
Yeah, we can do that, Keith.
Yeah, I can do that, and I'll email that out for you.
I'll take the next couple, Keith. So, Wendy, your question regarding the apprenticeship journey and responsibility. It's a three-way partnership between us as the endpoint assessment organisation, the employer, and the training provider. And when you register with us for endpoint assessment, it's up to you who you make the responsible person on the SEPA platform. So that could be the employer, if that was the way the partnership works between the training provider and the employer, or equally it could be the training provider. Generally, it will be all three. As far as the pass rate for apprentices is concerned, I think it's still too early for us to be able to publish that kind of information when we've still got so many apprentices in the gateway window. The volumes, I think at this stage, aren't sufficient to provide a truly valid pass rate from an NCFE perspective. And I think that's it for the questions. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will leave the webinar open for 5 or 10 more minutes. If you have any more questions, we will answer them and email them out. Thank you, and thanks, Keith.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.